All right, welcome everybody. We're sorry we're running a little bit late this morning, just a few technical snafus, but we will have Mary and MJ joining us shortly here as we get situated to do our last and final discussion with Jill and Mary. I'm a little sad, but also really hopeful for what's to come out of this. I know there's been a lot of great conversation starters that's happened. The videos are circulating on YouTube and have been shared numerous times out there. So information is getting out the way we want it to. But also a little, a little sad that the series is over and how the series had ended. So if you haven't seen the last and final episode, sorry, there's going to be some spoilers in this one because there's going to be topics that we will discuss based on what happened on that particular episode. Mary, and thank you for joining us. You finally made it with us. But also on a much kind of heavier heart is what's truly going on in our country right now, and where people are feeling just a lot of heavy shoulders and a lot of heavy hearts. And I want to kind of loop some of that, some of those emotions into, the conversation we're going to have today, because people need a source of light, need a source of direction. And, if we women in this panel can be that, let's do it. If, the organizations that we represent and work for can be that, let's do it. And all of that will be covered today. So please help me welcome back to our third and final discussion about Mrs. America, all things women, the ERA, and just lots of fun and good, wholesome conversation with Jill and Mary. Wait to the cameras if you can, and host today with MJ. So welcome. How are you, Jill and Mary, doing?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Larcy. Good to see you and MJ.
Yes. Hi, MJ. How are you this morning? Oh, you're on mute. I don't want to mute you.
I woke up really excited for this final conversation with Jill. I'm really looking forward to really learning more from her and just learning how to really take everything in that's happening today, like you mentioned, Larcy. It's really important to me to have someone to look up to, like Jill and yourself and Mary and everyone who is part of our community. So thank you, Jill, for being here with us, and Mary. And let's get it. Let's talk.
Do this. Right. So
I'm so happy to see both of you, Larcy. I'm so happy to see you and MJ and Mary, because my optimism for the future grows when I see you, when I listen to you, when I know what you're doing with your lives and how you care about these issues and the future of our republic and how we deal with these big issues. It so depends on the involvement of every citizen, every vote, the people we elect, the issues we fight for. It so depends on that being carried forward. And we have this wonderful form of government, but it requires every citizen to work. It's not an easy process, and it's easy to sit there and criticize this government. And if you don't like it, you have the ability to organize and change. One voice calling in the wilderness is not enough. You have to organize with like-minded people and figure out how in a republic you make the difference. And it's actually a lot of fun, although it requires patience.
I agree. Yes, definitely. Further together is the message that we internally in the organization are saying. Yeah, you can go fast and you can go alone, but in order to sustain this work and to sustain our effectiveness in society is that we go further together. And we are really in this crucial time, we're trying to mobilize as many people as we possibly can. 2020 is a really, really crucial year. I can't emphasize that enough. And like you mentioned, I echo your same sentiments about everyone needs to just participate in this more than ever. So I want to just pick up a little bit where we left off in conversation number 2. We were kind of touching on a subject that resurfaced. So Roe v. Wade was in the news. I know it's really hard to kind of dig through the news right now because there's just so many things that keeps piling on, just kind of like my laundry over here, just like things just get thrown in this ginormous pile of
Well, you
stuff.
have some undone chores at home, is that right?
Yes, I guilty. And and it's hard sometimes to pick the meaningful ones that you want to either get hope from, or you want to think a little bit more about the facts that is associated with that topic. So Roe v. Wade came into surface a few weeks ago, and there is also a series on that right now, where there's been a piece of information that apparently was not truthful when that particular piece of legislation went to the Supreme Court. So, in your experience and in what you went through with the ERA and, the women's movement, when this particular, piece of news came out, with the Supreme Court back then, what was it like when it first started, but then what was it also like when, when that kind of went your way? And did this piece of news today, did that hurt or help the movement at all?
The statement of McCovey that she recanted her conversion.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the pleasures of having had these discussions with you is I've been able to go back and look up the history of some of these issues, and I encourage everyone to do it because it's fascinating. The women in that series are all interesting and unique, and they have backgrounds that aren't explored in the series. There wasn't time for that, but their lives were interesting. Their challenges were interesting. But even before that, the women of this country have been working to free themselves from being considered a second-class citizen. Our founding fathers had no intention, including really anyone in the Constitution except a certain class of white men, as it turned out. So women weren't included, slaves weren't included, people of color, people who didn't own property. So we've all had to recognize what wasn't included and try to get it guaranteed in the Constitution, because when it's not guaranteed, other people will find reasons to treat you differently. And the ERA is a good example of a recognition that being treated equally has a remedial effect, and it also imposes some new responsibilities. The history of this movement, all the way back to the 19th century, the first women's conference was held in 1848. And to read about the women involved in that, and to understand that there is a women's museum in Seneca Falls where that meeting was held. Frederick Douglass was there. There were men who were there. By and large, the women were well-educated, well-spoken, and very brave, because it wasn't considered acceptable for women to be interested in their own issues. But these women spoke out, and they were supported by intellectual men who saw the shortcomings of the Constitution. So we've had amendments to recognize things the Constitution didn't include. And it's really discouraging to think we're still talking about this long after the first ERA was introduced and passed out of the Congress, but we are. So let's just keep at this issue. Let's get it taken care of, and we can move on to other things too.
No, definitely. I think that it's tough, right? It's and I don't know if you had experienced this during the movement, but it's tough when you have the women who are really passionate about making sure that empathy and equality are all just kind of sprinkled every place that they possibly can. And for a piece of information like this that gets kind of sewed into it, that ends up being this it ends up turning out to be just the intention was that came from a bad place. It's tough because we see that now also, where there's the intention for something to be really, really good is there, and then somebody just wants to come in and kind of ruffle feathers. And I could go down a rabbit hole with that. That's not the issue today that we're going to discuss. But I want to actually go back to the last episode. We're talking about solidarity. We're talking about your experience with the women that came together, and making sure that you're lifting each other up every possible way you can. There's a scene that actually in episode 9 where Bella was let go. She was fired. And I wanted to know how accurate that march of solidarity of resignations, if that really occurred one by one, women, walking up into the line and just slamming the resignation letter on the table. How accurate was that?
And actually, that physical moment, I question the passion that engendered it and the actual effect. Women did resign from that commission because of the way Bella was treated. Carmen Delgado Vota was the co-chair with Bella of that committee. They offered the chairmanship to her and she turned it down because it was clearly a very egregious way to treat somebody. I mean, that was an interesting scene because while women were fighting in the 70s, encouraged by the passage of the ERA unanimously out of the Congress, encouraged by the early ratification, encouraged by Roe v. Wade, despite what Liz McCovey turned out being, which was really not a very upstanding person. And she certainly was bought off later on, and then she recanted that. And she, if you read about her, she had a hard life, and she pretty much lied her way through it, whatever provide her with the greatest advantage. So it was a difficult thing, and I'm sure her lawyers found it difficult to work with her. But she was bribed essentially to change her position. Mm-hmm. And that was used when it happened. I don't think it had much of a dent on the movement, but it was another talking point. But it turned out that in the building coalition of anti-ERA people, Roe v. Wade became another issue with which they could attract the Christian right, evangelical Christian women who really felt that was an attack on the family, something that shouldn't be allowed by the Supreme Court. So there began to be quite an attack on the Supreme Court. I can recall driving through countrysides in the South, and there were lots of signs on the road sign criticizing the Supreme Court, the justices on the court who voted for this issue. So it became a very, very big issue. And part of the phrase that they eventually, the Stop ERA people, formed a coalition with the people in the moral majority, which was formed by Jerry Falwell, a Baptist minister who thought he was observing a decay in the morals of the country. And of course, women were blamed for that because we were doing lots of things that we traditionally hadn't been permitted to do, allowed to do. And so they formed the phrase family values, which was brilliant, I think. It's not as though any of us or the women active then were opposed to family values. Most of us had families. But it was quite a unifying platform that turned into the very strong conservative right movement. And that was a factor in the firing of Bella. The moral majority and the conservative right were very pleased with the election of Jimmy Carter. He was a Baptist, a very Christian man. They thought he would be very supportive of the agenda, but not as much as they wanted. And they made a big effort to put pressure on Carter, and the outcome was he appointed Midge Costanza, and she eventually had to resign because she was a gay woman and she had such terrible pressure inside the White House. Bella was appointed to lead the women, but it turned out they wanted a commission, but they didn't want it to do anything. Bella was not somebody who would be a shrinking violet. You see a couple of times when she compromises because she's hoping to run for the Senate and she realizes there's a wider constituency than the women's movement. But she said what she thought, and that, I risk going on and on, but we all know that when people are elected to office, particularly the president, they have a cadre around them who are not as much interested in the issues as the polls and protecting the person around them. And President Carter had his Georgia Mafia, as they like to call it, and they were protecting him. And they thought that Bella's outspokenness, even the postponing of the meeting, which is highlighted in the episode, was disrespectful. And they just thought they wanted that issue to go away, and they certainly didn't want someone like Bella holding press conferences and talking about the inaction of the Democrats in power. I mean, the Democratic women really thought the election of Carter would be super helpful, that they'd be able to get many things done that they've been working on. But that didn't turn out to be the case because he was supportive, I think, of women's issues, but he wasn't willing to go out on a line against the growing power of the moral majority, the family values coalition that existed particularly in the South. I could go on and on. Let me stop. I'm sounding like a
You're good. You're good.
adult history professor.
It
The
sounds
more you
like,
read, the
though,
more interesting it is. So I'm encouraging everybody to start to read about that era in history. It's just as interesting as
yes.
I think it is.
So would you say that that was probably kind of the tip of the iceberg of when politics started to become a little bit more personal for a lot of people, and how it's the religious aspect of our livelihood and our lifestyles became I guess a weapon of choice? I mean, that may be a little bit harsh to say weapon, but a choice for a lot of people, and how religion became politicized. Would that be like the kind of the starting of all that? Interesting though, how would those conversations sound like when you're now throwing gospels and Bible verses into arguments? How is that like navigating, putting pieces of legislation together when you're, wanting to incorporate some, moral majority language into something like that? Or was it completely separate at that point also?
Well, the moral majority was founded in 79. Carter was elected in 76 and served till 80. So they were a growing force because they formed alliances. Phyllis was very good at recognizing the importance of a coalition. You saw her jealously guarding her list. And those are important. Coalitions are important. And having meetings where you find like-minded people and drawing strength from that. And finding leadership within your group. So the issues that became known as the Family Values Platform was based very much on what the moral majority found: the erosion of the American family caused by the ERA, for one thing. Women will be out of the family doing their traditional role that binds the family together. The Roe v. Wade decision, the issue of gay and lesbian rights back then was, I don't mean to imply it's not a struggle now, but back then it was a real flashpoint. And they were very interested in putting in the religious issues. Falwell decided to blend church and politics. And historically, church and state are separated. Most ministers didn't preach political theory overtly from the pulpit. But Falwell decided to do that. And he had a program on TV called the Grand Old Gospel Hour. It was on once a week talking about these issues and the threats to the family. And It was frightening, the things that he supposed were going to happen to society with these changes. They wanted prayer back in the schools. White flight and segregation in the South was a big issue. That often in many cities in the South, after Brown versus Board of Education, white families took their children and formed independent, out of the public school systems, academies that were Christian-based. And an issue was, were they tax deductible? Those are things that are kind of burbling under the surface, but they are part of the framework of why these organizations are formed, why they were able to get so much money. A huge amount of money was pumped into the moral majority, which by that time was the moral majority, family values, stop ERA, anti-abortion. There were a whole bunch of issues that were included in that. And they had a great deal of power. And they turned their face to Jimmy Carter, disappointed in him, and supported Ronald Reagan. And you see in that episode how Phyllis makes her decision.
Yep.
She is going to be all in for Ronald Reagan. She sees him as a very conservative man, and she has been dreaming of this for quite a long time, a conservative president. And that poignant moment when she gets a phone call from him, on which Oliver hopes to be Secretary of Defense, or, one of the issues the moral majority talked about was the SALT Treaty, Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty. So there was a lot of, we don't want to be in coalitions with the Russians. We hate communism. That was a big thing for Reagan. So the moral majority was all in on that issue. So it was complex. They were all behind Reagan, and Reagan turned his back on Phyllis, and she was crushed.
Yeah.
And she obviously had become a slightly different person in that episode. She recognized how important it was to be in the seats of power. You had to be in Washington. And that phone call helped her realize even going isn't enough. You have to be there, not as the head of an advisory committee. You have to be in the cabinet, and you have to bring some leverage with you. But there are cabinet members throughout history whose names you've never heard of, who were very good, and some just kind of sat there because they didn't have any leverage to get things they cared about, if they cared about anything particularly. So they went along, and obviously Phyllis wasn't going to be like that. She knew what she wanted, and she wanted to be in the middle. And she had no power. She thought she did, but she didn't. It was like Bella. Bella had support of the women's organization. She was a well-known political figure. She could get a press conference just by stepping outside, and it wasn't enough. If you're not there, you don't have a lot of leverage unless you build a big coalition. That is the leverage you can bring with you.
And that's that message of not being enough. Oftentimes, we've heard that, and we want to teach our, now that I have my 2-month-old daughter with us joining our family, and I don't ever want her to hear those words. I don't ever want her to feel like she's not enough. And I'm sure you raising your own family have also told your children like those words are BS. It's not something that you need to echo into your chambers of your heart and your brain. So there's going to be obstacles, of course, but also, like you said, you need to bring alliances together, and an important alliance in the work that we do, are our spouses. And I love to see that, even though we're seeing a side of Phyllis the way that we do see her husband really, really supportive of, even though she is fighting to keep the women in the house. He's still really supportive of her going outside the house. And, we see glimpse of your home in the episodes where Bill is really supportive of your ambition and your endeavors to go beyond the movement and to bring more women into the fold of the movement. So that's, that support itself is really, really good throughout the whole film. And so MJ and I were kind of talking, and we're kind of interested in seeing what it was like that, one, you are spearheading, you're helping to spearhead a women's movement, but also at some point you may run across your husband every once in a while in the halls of the White House. So MJ, what was that question? I don't remember exactly what it was.
Yeah, no, we were really curious, and it was more about what you just said, Larcy. Like, what was it like to lead a women's movement and having a husband who was in politics during a patriarchal political environment, knowing that there were times where your engagements might cross paths?
Well, that's a good question, and I think you can see, maybe not, but it's something that brought it back to me. For me, I felt like it was something of a tightrope act.
Mm.
Honestly, I believe that my ability to be in the White House, working in the White House, even though I spoke in their feelings, I spoke for many progressive women, was because Billy was a known figure in the Republican Party, and they tolerated me. And I had an office in the executive office building, but I just remember a conversation in the hall that I happened to walk by on the way to an elevator once. And a cabinet member was walking down the hall, maybe with a friend or somebody from his district, saying, as they passed me and walked a few steps by, "She's our House Libber." And it was very clarifying for me. I knew most of the men there, and we talked, and I wasn't haranguing them all the time, and they weren't bringing up issues they disagreed with, but that's the way they thought about me. And that it was a very derogative term at the time, a libber. It carried a lot of associations that nobody wanted or that weren't very useful in getting legislation passed or people elected. One of the organizations, MJ and Marcy and Mary, that I'm very happy to have been associated with was the Women's Political Caucus. And single issue organizations are very satisfying because they set a target, they're very focused. And of course, information flows in from the outside, but the Women's Political Caucus dedicated itself to getting more women elected to public office at the county level, at the city level, at the state level, at the national level. And it was bipartisan. And I was asked often when I spoke on behalf of the caucus, well, why do you think we'd have a better society with more women in public office? And I had answers, perfectly obvious to me, but evidently not to everybody. I had answers, but one of them was because they would press, do you think women would vote differently? Yes, I do. And yes, I do think women bring other issues up. If you're ideologically pure, then you're categorized and probably not given a lot of attention. But if you're a politician, which represents your district or people besides single issue people, I think women have proven, let's not say everyone. And in this era, somebody would immediately say, well, what about? No, let's talk about the women who are leading countries as prime minister, who've been effective in this coronavirus worldwide pandemic. And we can point to the Prime Minister of Denmark. We can point to Angela Merkel in Germany, who's clearly the strong voice in Germany. We can talk about the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who immediately formed a coalition. That's one of the things women recognize. When you're without power, you try to build it up by bringing other people around you and making your volume bigger than it would have been if you were a single voice. She formed a coalition with the Prime Minister of Australia, these two islands floating around there with lots of traffic back and forth every day. They formed a bipartisan coalition because he's very conservative and have addressed the virus and the difficulties in putting in safeguards, but also protecting their countries. It's been a very, very successful coalition. So I do think women have particular skills, many of us, in building coalitions, in listening well, in following through. Yes, I think the Women's Political Caucus and getting more women in public office has been a very important part of the women's movement. And there are so many more women now in Congress, in state legislatures, as mayors and governors. We just need more women in Washington, D.C. So that's a whole other issue about whom to vote for, but we have an important vote coming up, and
Yes, yes.
you cannot be careful enough about who you vote for. Something, the person you give your trust to should always be the person running of the highest and finest character. That's the ability not just to promote himself, but to be interested in the people he represents, their well-being. I could talk a long time about politicians I have known, but let me stop.
Speaking of politicians, we're going to actually go down a little bit more of this topic. So, a politician known by the name of Reagan, you may be familiar with him. There's a question that popped up, and we wanted to know a little bit, and kind of wanted to unpack Bella's resignation. And we're talking about, how do we form alliances, or where do we put our energy towards an alliance, and at what point do we ourselves kind of stick our neck out and be a good ally and be comfortable enough in this space where solidarity is needed. And at that moment of the resignation, there was definitely solidarity, but also women risking their livelihood for it, right? Because they needed, most of those women they're paying jobs, and that meant they didn't have one anymore if they were going to be in allyship and in solidarity of Bella. And so at the end of that episode, I loved seeing the women coming together, but there was a question that popped up, and I want to address this. But do you feel and do you believe that you had a big effect on Reagan's decision not to nominate Phyllis to his cabinet?
I personally, the women's movement, yes, I do, because it was a looming force. I wasn't the only Republican feminist. There were other really wonderful, intelligent Republican women who supported the Equal Rights Amendment, who worked for women's rights and women in politics, and many of them went on to run, and I could name a long list, but he was aware of that group. And there were feminists who went to work in the Reagan White House. Quite honestly, I don't think any president has paid a lot of attention to these issues. Reagan immediately stopped fighting for women's issues. There's no mention of the ERA. There's a disavowal of Roe v. Wade in platforms when Reagan was running and reelected. So he wasn't for women, for the issues we cared about. I always thought there was some ground there that we could get him to recognize, but he cared mostly. My husband used to say, Reagan doesn't get involved in the details. He knows he's against communism. He wants Republicans to limit the budget. And I'm struggling to think of the third issue. But there were three things that he cared about a lot. And he didn't know much about the environment. He didn't care much about women's issues. And the people around him didn't want him to risk very much because they knew where the wind was blowing. And Reagan's 2 terms were the highlight of the moral majority. He spoke a lot with the leaders of that group. He appointed some of them to commissions that he had to represent family values and education issues, took advantage of their position to pass some legislation that was encouraging to private schools, the academies that were formed by the Southern families that were against integration. So, yeah, I don't think Reagan moved us forward at all. And I don't think our presence made much of a difference, although I do definitely remember being active in the convention in 1980 when he was nominated and elected. And the active women Republican feminists wanted to have a private meeting with him so we could talk to him about what he proposed to do for women and what platform he would support. And this was in Detroit when we were we were either nominating or renominating. Maybe this was his second term. And out of that meeting came the one thing that women who went recognized as important. They got a commitment. He committed to appointing a woman to the Supreme Court. There were no women on the court, never had been. That was one of the issues we went in to talk about, and he agreed and he committed to that. Whether he would do it or whether he'd have the opportunity to do it, we didn't know, but he promised, and he did. He appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court. The first woman. It was really a monumental thing to have occurred because, of course, the first one makes the second one easier, et cetera, et cetera. But so being a Republican with my husband, who was in the administration and quite a wonderful force in his own right, I worried about jeopardizing his position. And I always felt if I got too far out or too far in front or was explosive in my opinions, like Bella and some of the Democratic women could be, because I think the noise level in the Democratic Party is always higher than it is in the Republican Party, generally speaking. I wouldn't have been in those circles. I wouldn't have had the slightest chance of having a voice heard. And I'm sure you've had that experience. You've sat in meetings where you kind of held your tongue, or you shaped your advocacy in a mollified way with the attempt to draw in more people. And you knew if you were strident and too noisy, it would give them such an easy excuse to bail on the issue. Because it was so easy for men to make fun of women that too noisy, too everything. Women in public life, women who spoke too much, women who were too noisy.
Too emotional.
At that moment, were quite irritating. Obviously, it's much different now. That's what I'd love to ask you two about. You are leaders and you are in forum of your own leading, and are you aware of how loud, how often, with what words you advance things that aren't part of the general consensus when you're on a board or a commission. We asked my daughter first because she works around the world and groups like that on different issues, but you are a woman in a leadership position, Mary.
Yeah, I definitely think about that, Mom. And I think, Larcy, I love your question about Mom and MJ, how you put it about if she and Dad were in the same place and how did that make her think differently. I think, Mom, your and Dad's Midwestern upbringing helped you a lot, because those values of humility and listening are really just, you grew up with them, and that's part of your core, who you are and who Dad was. And so I inherited that from Mom and Dad for sure. So I do think about that when I'm in meetings, with people from other parts of the world. So I think some of it is a female thing, but some of it is just your personality. And I know, Mom, you've talked about this a lot. I really value the quote noisy voices too, because like you've said, it was great to have Bella and Betty speaking out and sometimes being a little bit outrageous, because that they got the issues out there and then people were talking about them, and then you could kind of rein it in and bring in some more common viewpoints. And yeah, I find that that's the role I prefer to play, just because of my personality. But I think we need the noisy people in some settings just to get the word out there, and the agitation is needed. And then we need people like you, and the way I like to do it, to try to find the common purpose. But yeah, MJ and Larcy, how do you guys feel about this? Like Mom is asking, you guys have really interesting perspectives.
Well, I can go first. And, when you described the tightrope, I immediately focused on like a feeling of that. And it is a constant balance, honestly, because, I have led other nonprofit organizations where, the leadership not only was this young individual, but a person of color and a woman. So you're dealing with all these double whammies to begin with. That's kind of challenging the regular status quo out there of what leadership really needs to look like. So I've had my fair share of, biting my tongue, and if I stick my neck out, who's going to chop it, and but I have this itch I have to. I actually did that this morning, and then this morning though, and I want to eventually put the question back to you, but in those moments of weighing the risks in your head, what do you do? Do you act, or do you just still continue to stay paralyzed? And sometimes fear is a paralyzing thing. And that fear could be fear of judgment, fear of the consequence, good and bad, that could come out of this act, right? And so right now, looking back at what I did this morning, I said, the hell with it. What do I got to lose at this point? There is a lot of people out there who in the past have looked up to our leadership, and who have looked up and found our voices as guiding principles. And where are they now? Where are you now? Are you continuing that, or do you have to only be in that position to only do so? If you're naturally a leader, you're going to lead, regardless of wherever you're at in the position. You're just going to corral people, you're going to mobilize people, and do what you were saying, Mary. It's really also your personality, and I believe that my personality is, to want to corral a group in a very positive setting, but very hard nowadays to find positivity, very hard nowadays to find good that is happening amid all the bad happening. And I'm in my head a lot to say, what sounds good? What can I say to uplift? What can I say to motivate myself, to uplift myself, so that I continue to motivate? And so lots of quotes that I always have to kind of echo in my head as a reminder. If I can't find the words, I look to people like Mary and people like you, Jill, to see what you've said in the past, because sometimes we are lost for words, and we just need one word to kind of spark up this idea. And I look up to people a lot to see how they have felt and dealt with this adversity and dealt with the confusion in their head and their hearts. So even for you two children, continue to light the way. That light reaches really far, and who thought that you would be, in a Zoom call right now, decades later, after doing a women's movement, really inspiring two immigrant women who migrated here from the Philippines, one from Mexico, to want to corral and mobilize other women in our communities, to still do women's work, and to still do this fight, with women and about women. And I can go on with that, but I'm going to stop there. MJ, what are your sentiments on that as well? As you're an inspiring leader?
Thank you. No, I want to echo a lot of what you said, Larcy. I think as a woman in general, it's really hard for us to speak up and in spaces where we normally are not, first of all, invited to, or in spaces where we don't feel comfortable. I've had the privilege and the opportunity to speak up in many spaces, but those spaces have definitely given me that opportunity. And as a woman of color, as a brown immigrant woman of color, I've had my fair of like moments where I've had to bite my tongue, to either give space for other people to speak up, because I want to also echo what Mary was talking about. I've also grown up with very strong values of humility and just being able to accept that I also have to step back sometimes for others to speak up. I am very loud when I speak. I'm very outspoken. I'm very outspoken when I want to be, and when something really is I'm really passionate about something. And I recognize that at times I do maybe not give an opportunity to other women to speak up. But when there's moments where I've had the opportunity to be the only woman in the room, I know that I have to do it because there's no other woman to represent, and there's no other people to really come forward with the issues that we all care about. And so those are the moments where I've been like, okay, like you said, Larcy, what the heck? Like there's really nothing to lose. My voice really matters in this very moment. But I have had to step back with a lot of humility and making sure that other women in the room or other people who are maybe a little bit more shy or maybe a little bit more intimidated with the people in the room, I've had to be able to kind of, push them to speak up or be someone they can, look up to or whatever. But yeah, definitely I've had those moments in my life where I've had to be the leader, and sometimes also be the person who steps back and watches people be the leader, and that's okay with me too.
So, Jill and Mary, we are, rising leaders in an organization that, want to mobilize voters, want to get a community involved to understand the importance of exercising that right to vote. We're doing a lot of activities right now, reaching out to people in other communities to get them to understand that their vote really matters. And, we have been really, really lucky to really hit some home runs in our efforts. And then there are some times where we just like strike out, and also not understanding the kind of conversations we should be having with, our own personal network, our own personal community, because within that network and community, there is diverse thought, there are diverse opinions. And you saying walking that tightrope of, leaning in and then also leaning back. Our abs may be great this time in our lives because that constant back and forth of exercise in what women need to do. But, when you're in your experience, Mary and Jill, when you had to do that, what were some things going through your head? What did you have to remind yourself to even do and say to just get through that moment?
I've had an experience in my life of being the first woman on a board of directors, a corporate board, or a nonprofit of a university. But my experience on corporate boards as the first woman is you really feel constrained. You know somehow that somebody put you on there, but it was probably because of affirmative action and they had to. And you want to prove your ability to be there. And then after 2 or 3 meetings, you realize there's an awful lot of, there's a lot being decided that you have something to add to or to ask a question about. And the other men who are on the board do spend a lot of time talking about their experiences, and that can be useful, or it can simply be establishing themselves in the alpha pack, where they are in the order of things. Yeah, but it's a very useful skill. I am sure that the women leaders I've been talking about do it all the time. And you know, the women in Congress do it all the time. They pick their moment to speak in committee meetings. They gauge how strident they are. I mean, there have been moments, I could count them on one hand, when I yearn to be able to just get up and make some kind of wonderful statement and leave the room. But the problem is you can't come back in. If you come back in, you're greatly diminished.
Yeah.
And so you make that decision. Am I giving up completely, or do I want to continue to see what kind of influence I might have if I just hold myself in check this time and wait for a moment to present something reasonable? I'm sure you've had that experience, MJ. And I mean, the grand moment when the housewife, I've seen this in movies more than once, in the kitchen, in a frustration moment, takes a plate and smashes it on the floor. I can't say I've ever had a domestic moment like that, because really I was married to quite a remarkable, intelligent, empathetic man who supported me all the time. I never felt my relationship was at any risk, but I didn't want to hurt his career either. But you can see Phyllis had quite a different boat to row. When her husband stands there and her heart is broken about Reagan, she's not going to be going to Washington. She's not going to be talking about the SALT treaty. He's disappointed. He leans against the door jamb and he says, "What time's dinner?"
Yep.
Ooh, that's a painful moment for her. But I'm sure you've all had those moments, and you don't do that. And every woman in Congress, every woman, and I'm sure it's true for minorities. It's the person who's in the minority in an organization represents something much deeper and broader than their own personal interests, and they have to think constantly about how to present it, how to make it sound like common sense. So yes, we're still working on the ERA. And Roe v. Wade is under constant attack. And it's much later, and we're stunned, but we have to keep at it. And I admit to being not as vibrant as I once was, so I'm so depending on you and all of your friends to find that to be a worthwhile fight. Let's get the ERA in the Constitution. Anybody who tries to find a reason why it shouldn't be now is just fighting for the sake of fighting. They're not really interested in the purpose of the ERA. And we just read today about there's only one possibility in the state of Missouri anymore for a woman to go be counseled and have an abortion. And that's a terrible decision. No woman is frivolous about that. It's something you never forget. But the option to make that decision ought to be yours. And I have heard arguments put forward by councils in which only men spoke and only men were in the deciding body. I have watched where the value of Planned Parenthood was debated by only men, where, frankly, I've listened to priests and bishops talk about women's issues. And if you're not part of the discussion, then you have no opportunity. And it's a lot easier if there's more than one, which is why finding good women, and there are lots of women running for office now for the House and the Senate, but those women should be supported if you find they represent your values. Anyway, it's a voice for the vote, for your purpose, at common purpose. Get more people registered, more people alert to the fact that they need to vote. This argument about mail-in ballots is something we ought to have an opinion about and be active about. And there are many issues like that. I've been asked by people, what can I do? But the challenges are all around you. For women's rights, what to do about these issues, who to elect to represent us, what can I do locally? And right now, voting seems to be one of the paramount issues. And that's why I admire what all of you are doing with Common Purpose.
Thank you. And oh, yes. So we are just a few minutes away from closing up this discussion. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for taking the time the past 3 different Saturdays to really talk about, the ERA, the miniseries, Mrs. America, different women that you had a long time career with, and they all did great things, even though at the end of season 9, it was like a defeat on both sides. They went on to do great things. You and a few others co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus, which I also went to a convention not too long ago. So I'm very proud to be a member of that. Steinman created and launched Bring Your Daughters to Work Day. So just to name a few of all the magnificent things that women leaders are capable of doing, the creativity that we all have if we have the right support, the right alliances from everyone around us, good and bad, to be able to balance a lot of that out. So women, if you want to speak up, speak up. If you want to just see what the landscape looks like and think a little bit more, that's okay too. If you don't want to participate at that moment, that's fine. It's all good. We all have a way to participate in society, like Mary had said, and we look upon to leaders like Jill to kind of light the way, because she's been there and done that, and we can take a lot of lessons from that, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But at the end of the day, don't be afraid to want to break the damn plate.
I like that.
I love that.
That's the new hashtag. Don't be afraid to break the damn plate.
Very useful.
Yes. So thank you, Jill. Thank you, Mary. I hope that a lot more conversations spark from this. We will be continuously calling to you when we have those bite your tongue moments again, or just curious about how not to repeat some of history's do's and don'ts. But you're also part of the CP community, which we also admire and appreciate, that you are committed, that you support our commitment to this work. But thank you again, and thank you for being with us the rest of this gloomy kind of Saturday morning that we're experiencing right now. But everyone else, please stay safe. Please be well during this pandemic, and Common Purpose is here for you when you want to get involved, when you're ready to get involved. It's really, really easy, and you get to work with really young, inspiring leaders like MJ and I, and hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Marcy and MJ, Larcy and MJ. Such a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, we will be in touch. I promise you that. We will be in touch. This is not the last that you will hear of MJ and Larcy.
Be well, go forth.
Yes.
Thank you.
You as well. Thanks, Mary, for everything.
See you, MJ. Bye-bye.